want to warmly welcome you to the global digital book launch of the Diary of Dukesang Wong, A Voice from the Gold Mountain, edited by David McIlwraith, translated by Wanda Joy Ho, and published recently by Talon Books. My name is Tanner Merlis, and I'm going to be your host for tonight's event, and I'm based in Toronto, Ontario. I'd like to first acknowledge that the land that I'm virtually meeting you on, and concretely meeting you on as well, is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to thank the supporters of tonight's event and the organizations that have helped to build and promote tonight's event. And those organizations being the Socialist Project, the L.R. Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University, the Center for Social Justice, and the Toronto Workers' History Project. I especially want to give a big thank you, a big special thank you to Rina Fraticelli for her role in building this event. So briefly, the Diary of Dukesang Wong, A Voice from Gold Mountain, is the only known first-person account from a Chinese worker on the famously treacherous parts of transcontinental railways that spanned the North American continent. The diary was translated by Wanda Joy Ho, the granddaughter of Dukesang Wong, who had grown up hearing stories about a grandfather that she never met. Without Wanda Joy Ho's work of translating and preserving her grandfather's voice, this very unique and important record of life in both China and North America from a Chinese worker on the CPR in the 1880s would have been lost forever. As Jenny Kwan, the NDP MP from Vancouver East says, quote, Wong's voice brings to light the haunting chronicles of thousands of Chinese people in North America who suffered immensely in an inhospitable, racist society. The Dukesang Wong project was initially conceived as a documentary film and then an animated film. What you're about to see is a short promotional video made in partnership with the Shanghai Media Group more than 10 years ago.
During the last half of the 19th century, thousands upon thousands of Chinese men left war, hunger, and poverty in China and traveled to every corner of the globe in what has been called the Great Chinese Diaspora. Between 1880 and 1885, more than 17,000 came to Canada, a land they called Gold Mountain, to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway. In the summer of 1880, a man living in a northern province of China decided to seek his fortune in a place he called Gold Mountain. His name was Dukesang Wong. During his journey, and for the 50 years he lived and worked in Gold Mountain, Dukesang Wong did something that no other Chinese railway worker did. He kept a diary. As far as anyone is aware, it is the only written account of a Chinese laborer who worked on the construction of the CPR. It is hard, this laboring, but my body seems to have strength equal enough. The people working with me are good men, full of strength. There are many of us working here, but the laying of the railway progresses very slowly. It seems we move 2 stones a day, and they want this railway built across those high mountains, some 2,000 miles. The immigration building in Victoria, British Columbia was the first place the Chinese workers saw upon their arrival in Canada. Some of the men remained in the cells weeks at a time. A few wrote on the walls, scratching into the plaster with knives and other tools.
What you're looking at are wall plasters from the original immigration building here in Victoria. They were recovered in 1977, just at the moment the building was being demolished. They're wonderful pieces of immigration history. For many years, historians felt that it was probably impossible to find voices for the anonymous figures who contributed so much to Canadian history. But what I really like about these plasters is the voices that resonate out of the plaster themselves. It's the voice of the immigrant in a very uncertain moment in their life.
Having amassed several $100s, I left my native home for a foreign land. To my surprise, I was kept inside a prison cell. When I think of this, my tears begin to stream down. To whom can I confide my sorrow but to write a few lines in this room? The Chinese workers who came to Canada got the difficult and dangerous jobs. During those years, 4,000 Chinese men died. Many were blown to pieces or crushed in landslides, drowned in the Fraser River, or felled by sickness and disease. They were starved, robbed, and killed, and they were despised more than any other immigrant group in the history of this country. I have pondered about this fresh land, yet it is a land already full of sadness. We have been burying some of the people who died over the hard, foodless days, but the sight of those dead are hard to view. Wing Sung's savings were not enough to even send his body to Saltwater City, and I walked to his grave to apologize. The story of the Chinese railway workers in Canada clearly does not end with the completion of the railway. Many chose to stay and try to save the funds necessary to have their families join them. Men like Dukesang Wong wanted to settle in this new land. In my meditation last evening, a decision was formed. I will work here in Saltwater City. In this way, I can obtain some money, enough to bring Lynn over to this land to be my wife, for I am afraid for her life in the homeland. Historians in Canada have long argued that personal accounts of Chinese railway workers will never be found. Pierre Burton wrote, "Such details were not set down, and so are lost forever, lost and forgotten like the crumbling bones that lie in unmarked graves." But the voices have been there all along.
So moving forward, we have a number of guests joining us tonight. I first wanted to just welcome President and publisher of Talon Books, Kevin Williams.
I think any publisher of history or interested in social issues in Canada would be delighted to have this book because it contains original source material that should be in any library around North America, perhaps any library in the world. So this book is also was appealing to Talon Books, not just because of the historical significance, because of the original source material, because this material should be available to everybody, is important to scholars and people worldwide. But also David had worked a singularly long time on this project and done an enormous amount of research for it. And so consequently, he was able to contextualize the diaries and really create a reading experience for the general reader so that they can go and have a good understanding of where the diary fits in, experience it more fully because of David's annotations and work with the book. And so I think this crosses the book over into a general trade book and makes it more available to the general reader and readers all over, and obviously will allow it to enter into the school system and so forth more fully. I mean, it's extremely important that elements of history that we know exist, but whose stories aren't told, that haven't been brought forward in the past, that are kind of buried elements in their history. I mean, we know that people worked on the railway. We don't know much about them. There hasn't been much history. I mean, there is history in the sense of pure Britain, but really there's not a lot of pure history about them. But more important, or equally importantly, we also don't tend to think about the transition of these people from the work they were doing on the railway to Saltwater City, to citizens who went to their communities and built those communities up. And those communities are still thriving today. And the descendants of those people, as many of our on the call tonight, are still with us. And we want them to see themselves reflected in the history that's presented. It's so important that we hear original voices and that everybody in our cultural mosaic is able to find themselves in those reflections. We can't have only one image of history. We can't have only one image of people. We need to have all of them. And so it's really important to bring forth all these different stories, but even more so when you can ground it in a great piece of original source like material, as a unique piece like this. And as I said, it's important now that we honor where the stories come from, that we feel those stories are given permission to show the light of day, and then not just simply appropriated by a publisher like Talon Books, but actually find their way correctly and represent the people who want those stories told. So I thank everybody for coming tonight. I thank David and Wanda Joe and everybody who participated, worked so hard on this project. We want diverse voices to speak for themselves. We want diverse people to be able to find themselves in our books. And we want people to be able to feel that their stories are being told and they don't have to live on other people's stories. Thank you.
I'd now like to welcome Dr. Max Dagenet to say a few words about the work as well. Max is the author of several academic journal articles about Canadian history and is currently the research coordinator at the L.R. Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University, one of the partners and supporters of tonight's launch. So welcome, Max.
All right, everyone can see this famous photo. Yeah, thumbs up, good. Okay, so taken on November 7th, 1885, the last spike, which is this photo, is one of the most famous, arguably one of the most famous photographs in Canadian history. Remembered by most as the moment when the final railway spike was driven by company director Donald Smith, it represented the completion of the transcontinental Canada Pacific Railway. Now, to many, it was a great achievement for a young nation. It connected British Columbia to the rest of Canada. It improved communications. It transported settlers and goods to Western Canada. Some historians have even suggested that it was a symbol of Canadian unity and that the photograph was, and I quote, captured the birth of our nation. However, and with historians, there's always a however, this photograph and this rosy interpretation do not tell us the full story, far from it. This rosy view hides a story of abuse, of incredibly dangerous working and living conditions, and of racism. Laborers working on the railway faced extremely difficult and dangerous working conditions, and no group faced more abuse and danger than the Chinese laborers that helped build the CPR. It's estimated that about 15,000 Chinese laborers were brought in to construct a railroad, and more Chinese laborers died during the construction of the railway than any other group. Since Chinese laborers worked in the mountains of British Columbia, they were frequently killed by falling rocks, avalanches, and in explosions used to tunnel through the mountains. And for their sacrifice, Chinese laborers were paid half of what a white worker was making, were forced to buy their own supplies, and were forced to build their own camps. Now, in the aftermath of the last spike, this photo, a hostile and racist settler population even sought to stop Chinese immigration into Canada. And to discourage Chinese immigration, the Canadian government introduced a $50 head tax in 1885, which was raised to $100 in 1900 and to $500 in 1903. Now, this was, of course, more money than a Chinese laborer would make in 1 year. Now, Chinese immigrants, as stated by historian Henry Yu, remain the only group in Canadian history that was ever forced to pay taxes based solely on their country of origin. Now, the book that we're celebrating today, the Diary of Dukesang Wong, which I have my copy right here, is a very important book that every Canadian should read. It shows us that behind every rosy photograph, every rosy interpretation of a historical event, lays a darker side. The Diary of Dukesang Wong reveals a story of racism, exploitation, and danger associated with being a Chinese laborer working on the CPR and living in Canada in the late 19th, early 20th century. But it's also a story of endurance, of perseverance, and of resilience in the face of danger and hostility. We at the Wilson Institute for Canadian History are extremely happy to be here to celebrate the publication of such an important historical source, one that historians and the general public alike will find extremely valuable in furthering our understanding of Canada. I'd like to thank Rena, the Socialist Project, and everyone that organized this event for allowing us to be a part of this today, and to David and Wanda for producing such a wonderful book. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Max, and we're really happy to have you here with us tonight. We really appreciate that important history and contextualization of the moment and of the value of the work. And again, shedding light on what's too often disappeared by rosy myths of nation and nation building. Now we have our feature guest for this evening, David, to say the hello and to read a bit from the book's introduction. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Tanner, and thank you for those wonderful introductions. As I said to a few people earlier, I started work on this project in I think around 2005. I'd like to think that was, before I went to university, but it's not. It was a project that fascinated me from the very beginning, and I'll talk about that later. But a lot of people worked with me on this project over the years between 2005 and today. People in the film business. I saw Betsy Carson up there a minute ago. I saw Eve Ma up there a while ago. The people who contributed an enormous amount to the, there's Betsy, hi Betsy, to the development of this project. It was frustrating, and I ran into brick walls all the time, as filmmakers, independent filmmakers tend to do on a regular basis. And it was finally decided that I wasn't at that time in my life going to be able to make the film I wanted to make. And it was, Kevin mentioned Colin, my dear friend Colin Brown, who said to me one night and over dinner when I was bemoaning the fact that we couldn't get the film made, do it as a book. And the next thing you knew, he had contacted Kevin and the book was underway. And I have to say that I've been thrilled. I've loved the process of working on the book. It's just been a joy for me. And I think, in fact, that it's in many ways a better project than the films would have been. Rena Radicelli jokes all the time that now that the book is out, many people will come forward wanting to make a film. We'll see about that. I'm going to start by reading the first couple of pages of the book, the introduction to the book, because it really does kind of set things up. So I'll do that now, if you'll bear with me. In the spring of the year 1867, in a Chinese village a long day's journey north from the capital city, a local family hosted a banquet. In all likelihood, the regional magistrate, an officer of the imperial court, was given the place of honor at the banquet table. As if his position in the community were not reason enough for the seat of honor, just a few days earlier, he had ruled in favor of his host in a land dispute. The magistrate couldn't possibly have suspected that the food set before him that night would be laced with arsenic, and that he would die before the sun rose the next morning. The magistrate's only son was 21 years old that spring. He was deeply affected by his father's death. In the days and weeks following the poisoning, he began to keep a diary, a record of his grief and confusion during a tragic time in his young life. He would continue to keep the diary through tragedy and triumph for 5 more decades. For over 50 years, Dukesang Wong made compelling and eloquent entries into his notebooks, first about his life as a young man in imperial China, and then about the life he went on to live half a world away on a continent he called the land of the Golden Mountains. Little did he know that more than 150 years later, his diary would become the only primary source, the only known voice for thousands of his generation. Dukesang Wong was one of millions of Chinese men who emigrated from their homeland to escape war, rebellion, famine, and poverty in the latter half of the 19th century. Buoyed by exaggerated stories of gold nuggets to be scooped off the ground in places with names like New Zealand and America, they traveled to every corner of the globe. Between 1850 and 1885, tens of thousands of Chinese men came to the United States and Canada to pan for elusive gold and build transcontinental railways across both countries. First-person accounts of the Chinese workers who built railways across the North American continent are not supposed to exist. Canadian historian Pierre Burton wrote in The Last Spike, published in 1971, that, quote, "Such details were not set down, and so are lost forever, lost and forgotten like the crumbling bones that lie in unmarked graves, unquote. In May 2019, in a New York Times piece, American historian Andrew Graybill wrote that, quote, the lived experience of the railroad Chinese has long been elusive, partly because no sources written in their own hand have survived. The notion that no primary source exists because no one ever set words to paper, or that whatever was written had all been lost, seemed unlikely to me. Surely there had to be written accounts, primary sources of some type, hiding forgotten in someone's attic. 20th century histories of the building of the transcontinental railways in North America usually devoted several pages, or rather very few pages, to the thousands of Chinese workers who built significant portions of those rail lines through the American West and through Canada's treacherous Fraser Canyon. Nevertheless, the histories were intriguing to me, not least because they revealed so little about the workers. Most often, there were no names included, few anecdotes about any one of them, and little about what they did other than to say that they worked at the dirty and dangerous jobs, or that so very many of them died. Why the blank space in our histories? The stories of the Chinese workers told and taught for 100 years across North America have largely been stories of nameless people. Perhaps that was the fate of most working men and women in the 19th century. But we now know that the story of the Chinese in Gold Mountain is a very different story from all others who voluntarily crossed oceans to the shores of this continent.
Thank you so much for that reading, David. Indeed, we have a very special guest with us tonight. I'm pleased to welcome Judy Fong Bates. Now, I'm sure many of you know of her work already, but just in case you don't, Judy is a writer, storyteller, and teacher whose stories have been broadcast on CBC Radio and published in literary journals and anthologies. She is best known for her acclaimed short story collection, China Dog and Other Stories, her novel, Midnight at the Dragon Cafe, and her family memoir, The Year of Finding Memory. David and Judy go back a ways back to Guelph, where they went to high school together. And so we're really delighted to have Judy here tonight to discuss the book with David. So a warm welcome to you, Judy.
Hi, everybody.
Judy, thank you so much for doing this.
You're most welcome.
Judy and I, as Tanner said, first met in high school in Guelph, Ontario, far more years ago than either of us are willing to admit.
Yes.
After which we went our separate ways. And before you knew it, Judy had become a celebrated and award-winning Canadian author. We reconnected a few years.
Thank you, David, for your kind words.
We actually reconnected a few years back when she was doing readings of her book, The Year of Finding Memory, at UBC in Vancouver. And last year, Judy generously agreed to write the introduction to the Diary of Dukesang Wong, for which I am forever grateful. So
You're most welcome. My pleasure.
The story that Dukesang Wong tells in his diary happens between 1867 and 1918. And so, of course, we think of that as history. But it's more than just a dry history lesson for you, Judy. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Well, I think it's more than a dry history lesson for me, simply because the sentiments that Dukesang Wong expressed reminded me so much of my own parents. I'm actually a first-generation Canadian. I wasn't born here in Canada. I was born in China. And my father was one of the people who actually paid the head tax. He came to Canada in 1914. That doesn't mean I was born in 1914 or shortly thereafter, but he actually went back to China about 5 times, I think. And he had been married twice. My mother was also married twice, and I was the product of that second marriage. And so my father and my mother were both first immigrants here, and they suffered all the trauma, the loneliness, the displacement that Dukesang Wong faced. And also, my father, like Dukesang Wong, wrote, and he used to write poetry, and he used to sing Chinese arias as he did the laundry. And I think that they were very much about the homesickness, homeland. And so that reading that about Dukesang Wong and knowing that about my father gave the story a thread that actually continues to this day, because Canada still has new immigrants, and they may not be from China, you know, they're from Syria or they're from Iraq or Afghanistan. And I think that they continue to feel the same kind of trauma that comes from leaving a country and making that adjustment. And I think that there's that ripple effect of displacement too, which I'm sure that Wanda Jo can talk to.
You know, one of the things that I wanted to get at in the book was the idea that we have limited notion of who the founding nations are in this country. We tend to think of them basically as the English and the French. And yet when you read stories like the story of Dukesang Wong, to me, it makes us realize, I mean, he came here in 1880, long before so many other Europeans who consider themselves founding nations came. And thousands of other Chinese people did. And as you know, I've used the word in the book erasure a lot, because I feel that there was this attempt to erase the Chinese contribution to the building of this country. And so I've always felt that they were in their own right nation builders in this country. Would you agree with that?
Oh, of course I would. I think it's not just the Chinese, but there are other minority groups who came here early on. The Japanese were here. I believe the Sikhs were out in BC and instrumental in lumber. And so there were a lot of groups that haven't been acknowledged. And I actually wrote about this in my book, The Year of Finding Memory, and I wrote about it in a piece in the Globe, in which I talked about people like that. They weren't the important people. They weren't the people who, you know, passed pieces of legislation and chatted with the Queen, but they were, in a sense, the mortar that held all those bricks together. Those bricks, I guess, being the so-called important people, but in a sense, without the mortar, the bricks would fall. And so, you know, we did have our role, and it's taken, or taking, a very long time for that role to be acknowledged. And I think that groups like the one which I belong to are very gradually leaving the margins and coming into the mainstream. And certainly I know that when I went to school when we were in high school together in 1965, there was nothing of the Chinese in the history books.
Exactly.
At least here in Canada.
Exactly. I mean, you point out in the introduction to the book, and I had already written in the book about this, and Max mentioned it as well, that iconic photograph that Max showed us of the last spike, you know, that was the leaders, the president of the CPR and so on, with all his workmen gathered around him, and not a single Chinese face appears in that photograph, not a single one. And so that's a sad fact about how we recognize the nation builders of this country. And the same thing happened in the United States. So I wanted that notion to be talked about tonight, and I so appreciate your willingness to discuss that with us. So thank you so much for your contribution.
Oh, you're very, very welcome, and congratulations. I think this is a really important book, and it's an important addition to our history. And I hope that it will very soon be found in every school in Canada.
Me too. Thank you so much, Judy.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so next up, I'd like to welcome Sienna McIlwraith Fraticelli, David's daughter, who will be joining us tonight to read some of the diary entries with David. So a warm welcome to you, Sienna. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, my daughter. I should introduce this by saying that, you know, I first read Pierre Berton's book in university, again, more years ago than I'd like to admit. And it struck me at that time that there was something missing from the book. I remember thinking that at the time, and I remember carrying that with me, and always thought that I wanted someday to do something about that. In 1998, Rena and I went to China and adopted our beautiful, wonderful daughter when she was 2 years old. And that, if anything in my life, has changed me and drove me to pursue this project like I never pursued anything in my life. It was my daughter, Sienna. Oh, I just wanted to mention that the story of Dukesang Wong would never have never seen the light of day, and others have said this, without had Rhonda Joy Ho not decided to use it as part of a paper that she submitted to one of her professors at Simon Fraser University in the 1960s. She was Dukesang Wong's granddaughter, and although he died 14 years before she was born, she'd grown up hearing stories about him and about the diary he had written. So she tracked down the diary, and with help from two of her uncles, she translated several sections of it. Although the actual diary was lost in a building fire, and I've mixed my pages up, here we go. In a building fire, the translation was put in a cardboard box, which I then helped Wanda Joy find several years later in her garage in Ottawa. I had so very much hoped that she would be able to join us tonight to read from her translation, but unfortunately, because she's ill and because of the pandemic, she's in total lockdown in the seniors' residence where she now lives in Ottawa. So that's why I've asked my daughter, Sienna, to read those few diary entries while I read some of the commentary that goes with it. Dukesang Wong was born in China in 1846. After his parents died in the late 1860s, he left his home village and traveled to coastal communities on the Bohai Sea, where he became a tutor to children of families there. And after 10 years of tutoring, he made a difficult decision. Sienna.
Hi everyone. I'm going to start reading now. Summer 1880. I have decided to venture to that country they called the land of the Golden Mountains. Because I can't build my own homeland here in this country, it is right that I should attempt to seek land over the ocean. Several men with whom I've talked to tell me of the opportunities of establishing a home over on those Western lands. Perhaps it will prove to be too strange and foreign a land to which to adapt myself, but in the event that it is a better land that will allow me to once again establish a real home, I must try it. Tomorrow, I will finalize the necessary arrangements. I am heavy-hearted to say farewell to this land of my soul, my father. There have been many moments of joy and peace for me here, though the course of my life dictates that I must leave.
Wong boarded a ship in the summer of 1880 and set sail for Gold Mountain. He believed he was bound for San Francisco, which he called the big city. He reveals a number of emotions about leaving China, including sadness and loss of his birthplace and his childhood. He also expresses anxiety about the unknown place to which he is traveling, a place where laws and businesses are conducted for white people by white people. He even acknowledges some fear about his personal safety in the quote, barbaric lands where people kill each other every day. We can imagine that stories were circulating in the port as they boarded an onboard ship about lawless gunslingers in the wild wests of America. Dukesang Wong never made it to San Francisco. He disembarked instead at Portland, Oregon, and 10 months later went north to Canada. He soon began working on the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and within a year, the optimistic tone of his diaries had changed. The next 5 years were the bleakest of all his writings.
1883 to 1885. My soul cries out, I wish I had never experienced such bad days as those which we live now. So many of us Chinese suffered and died recently. I cannot recount them all. But the Western people will not allow us to land here any longer, while they scold us for not working enough. How these acts wear my soul down to nothing. The white people have enacted laws to prohibit any further landing of our people. I cannot understand why. There is much work to be done and not enough people to labor at it. But my words are meaningless, and my speech now falls upon deaf ears and closed eyes. These mighty lands are great to gaze upon, but the laws made here are so small.
What a great line. These mighty lands are great to gaze upon, but the laws made here are so small. In an 1885 entry, Wong writes for the first time about the new taxes. And he is, of course, referring to the now infamous head tax, enacted on July the 20th, 1885. It was clear in the months before the last spike was driven that much of the work on the transcontinental railway was coming to an end. The Chinese had served their purpose, and for the governments of British Columbia and Canada, it was time to stop this, quote, unwanted tide of immigrants. The head tax was intended as a disincentive imposed only on the Chinese. It is the only law of its kind ever imposed in this country. The Americans found a different way to slow migration from China. In 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring all Chinese workers from entering the US. Sadly, Canada followed Washington's lead in 1923 with the Chinese Immigration Act, excluding all Chinese immigrants except students and diplomats. The law lasted until 1947. As I recall, Judy's family came in 1952. She made it by 5 years.
No, my father came in 1914, and
Right.
my family started coming over. It was kind of a chain migration situation. One brother came in 1950. My mother and I came in 1955. A brother came in 1955, a sister in 58, and so on.
Right. But the point being that none of you were able to come before 1947.
That, absolutely.
Right. Yes. Okay. While most of the Chinese workers were abandoned by the CPR in 1884 and 1885, some literally left starving in caves along the banks of the Fraser River. Dukesang Wong continued to work on the railway until the end of the summer of 1886, when he met someone who would once again change the direction of his life.
Today I had met another man from my village. He proposed that we join together to establish a business to make clothes for others. He was a tailor in our village, and I can barely remember some references to him. I suppose that it is time that I establish a trade of my own if I am ever to earn respect, although I would also like to buy land and work on it, farming vegetables and livestock. But perhaps all of this is foolish, the result of too many dreams.
Wong decided not to be a farmer and eventually accepted the tailor's offer. After 2 years of learning the trade, he became a partner in the business, and 4 years later married a young woman who, in the traditional practice of imperial China, had been promised to him before he left Gold Mountain. His business flourished, and he was a leader in his community, becoming principal of the Chinese school and a leader of the Chinese Benevolent Society. He and his wife, Lynn, had 8 children, 7 boys and 1 daughter. He became very involved in the dramatic changes that were taking place in his homeland, and even entertained Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China. In 1914, he began to face another change in his life.
Sadness fills so much of me, yet joy is also in my soul in these warm days. Second son has left with the missionary ship to journey to the homeland. His going leaves us with such heavy hearts, for I already feel that I shall not hear his laughter again. I have allowed his journey, as a man must cease to linger in his home when searching for knowledge. Third son departs soon to enter university in eastern parts of this land. His ability in learning are high, and I am humbled by the honor which he has achieved in attending university. There is a zeal in his desire to help the ill and ailing, and it is unworthy of me to wish to hold him here. It is said that the old ways cannot always last, and that people must change and be continuously renewed. I have even taught this, yet I fear that I cannot change enough for this new world.
Dukesang Wong may have feared that he couldn't change, but as he's proved, and as he had proved a number of times, that was never the case. He had always believed in education and in the broadening of the mind. He lived to see most of his children attend universities and colleges. He died in Vancouver in 1931 at the age of 86, and his descendants today live in Europe, Asia, and all across North America. One of those descendants lives in Colorado in the United States. His name is Victor Calvin Ho. Calvin is Dukesang Wong's grandson and Wanda Joy's older brother. I'm so pleased to tell you that we hope he is our final very special guest at tonight's launch of the Diary of Dukesang Wong.
I'm here on behalf of Josh and Wanda. Neither of them could be here tonight. I'm Josh's girlfriend, and I am loving all of this. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get Wanda here tonight. We really tried.
I know.
Josh also couldn't be here, but here listening and recording, and I'm gonna bring everything to them. And I just want to know that you are being heard by at least
by the family.
Grandson.
That's great. I'm so happy to hear that. I expressed my deep, deep, deep gratitude to Wanda Joy and to Josh for making this extraordinary document available to the world. When Wanda Joy said, yes, I still have that translation and my essay in a box in Ottawa, I got on an airplane and flew there and knew in the moment that we had before us something very, very, very special. But I tell her I will come and see her as soon as this pandemic is over.
Okay, great.
I'm 73 years old, and I just published my first book, and it's the most wonderful, wonderful feeling you can't imagine. So don't ever think you're past it, because you're not. Okay.
Congratulations, David.
Congratulations, David. And now sort of for a little more interaction and participation, I want to thank David, Judy, Max, Kevin, Sienna, and Alexandra for your words and your contributions tonight. I'm happy to say we have about 25 minutes in the evening for audience questions to any of our participants. What I would like you to do, just to make the sort of Q&A process go a little smoothly, because we're on Zoom, if you could just type your question into the chat bar to me, and then I'm going to make a tally of the questions in the order in which they come, and then I'm going to read the question aloud, and then David or another one of our participants will be able to answer. First question from Michelle. What inspired you and made you, David, to do the research on the railroad workers and this project as a whole? So, what were the sort of key motivating factors for you to sort of delve into this history project, and sort of what really inspired your work in this regard?
Well, first of all, the fact that my politics is gears me to that. I'm very much on the politics of the left, but I really go back to my university days when I was doing my graduate degree at the University of Alberta. I read for the first time Pierre Berton's histories of the building of the railway in Canada. And what stayed with me from all of that and stuck with me and amazed me was the maybe 3, maybe 4 little pages that he wrote about the Chinese contribution to that railway. And it always grated me that there were, it was made clear that the vast numbers of people, of Chinese workers who were there. It was made clear the vast numbers of Chinese workers who died. And so that kind of started the clicks in my head that kept me going. And there were other events. I'm going to tell a couple of little stories. But preface it by saying that in the last few years, in the last maybe 10 years even, towns and villages in both Canada and the United States have begun to correct the terrible errors that they made, the terrible mistakes that they made in erasing the Chinese from their communities. They've begun to try to find, burned out pieces of wood that might have been part of a Chinese home and put it in some special place. But I'm going to tell stories about a couple of places I went, and I won't give names because I do think that those communities are trying to correct the errors. But a few years ago, I went to one town in British Columbia, in the Fraser Valley, and I knew from my research that town had a dominant Chinese community. The majority of the people who lived in that town were Chinese workers. And they had a board, glassed in board in front of their little museum. And it was filled with photographs about the history of the town and the pioneers in the town. And I stood there looking at the pictures, and I looked through every one, and there must have been 40. And in one of the pictures that I looked at, in this town that had a dominant Chinese population at one point, there was a picture of one Chinese person, and he was the houseboy of the Anglican minister in the town. And so it was those kinds of moments, those kinds of impacts on me when I was looking at them, that I thought that this isn't right. I went to visit another town on Vancouver Island that they refused to allow the Chinatown to be within their town. And so it was put outside, a kilometer outside of the town, built in a swamp, because that's the only place, the land that they would give the Chinese to build it. It became a town with the second highest population of Chinese in North America after San Francisco. And people don't know that. That's an unknown fact, that this town had that huge Chinese community, which was its own town because it couldn't be in the white town. Over the years, that Chinatown they began to destroy it. And in fact, in order to speed that process up, they decided to train their local fire department by burning down all of the buildings in the Chinatown and allowing their trainees to put out the fires. So, those are facts which are in our past, and I grant you we have come a long way since those pasts. But as I said to Judy earlier on, the word that comes to me most often when I think about what I've experienced, both in the United States and Canada, with regard to that history, is erasure. Whether it was conscious or unconscious, I don't know, but they were erased. There's a famous, I talk about this in the book, there's a famous story of the city of Tacoma in Washington, which had a significant Chinese population of over 200 people. And the townspeople wanted to get rid of them. And so they decided to gather 900 white residents, including the judge and the police chief and a bunch of others. They gathered up all of the Chinese residents of the Chinatown. They marched them down a railway track to a small railway station, put them on a train and sent them out of the state and told them never to come back. The next day, they went into the Chinatown, part of Tacoma, and they burned down every building in the place. Now, those stories get repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated in both the United States and Canada. And I found that intolerable.
This is a historiographical question that relates, I think, to the concept of erasure that you just mentioned. And so over the course of your research, have you come across any explanations or reasons as to why there's such a paucity of personal accounts of the Chinese migrant workers that built the railroad? So sort of why so few? Why only this one diary? Are there other sort of examples of work that would give expression or representation to the voices of the workers in this period?
You know, I tell stories like the Tacoma method, which is the name they gave to what happened in Tacoma. That became the Tacoma method, and it was practiced in many, many other places throughout North America thereafter. But, you know, I picture them driving these people out of their home, getting them out, saying, you're leaving now, them having to leave everything behind, then going in the next morning and burning it all down. And I wonder how many notebooks and how many diaries and how many drawings and how many other, you know, expressions, artistic or otherwise, that they might have, that literate people might have done that were simply destroyed, simply wiped out. There's also a theory that that much of the stuff that may have been taken back to China was destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. The communist government wanted all references to the West to be erased totally there too. So erasure isn't just something we do in North America. But you know, and there is some truth, limited truth to the stories I was told that a vast number of those Chinese who were peasant farmers were in fact illiterate. And so they didn't have the opportunity to write those things down, but no way that they were all illiterate. There were people who came here seeking to escape all of the terrible problems that existed in China, who might have been teachers and pharmacists and who knows what else, who might very well have kept those things, but they got lost.
The question of sources is I mean, it's a constant question that every historian has to tackle at some point, right? It's the majority of the sources that survive, unfortunately, are from, you know, like either like literate people who could write, who essentially made the point of keeping their records, but the majority of the records that survive are unfortunately from, you know, like the elite, right? And this is something that we have to tackle as historians. I mean, my period, so for those of you who know a little bit about Canadian history, my focus is the Canadian Rebellion of 1837-38. We know a lot of people participated. We know a lot of people were involved in the event. However, we only have very few firsthand accounts of the event from the political leaders that led the event, because so laborers, farmers who participated in the event, either they couldn't write, so they didn't keep records of what happened, or even if they wrote and they kept diaries, or they wrote letters to their wives and their children and whoever, because they were not considered important enough, they don't survive. Right. So it's always a really tricky thing as a historian to find these records. And it's, you know, it affects almost, unless you're part of this political, economic, social elite, very, very few records do actually survive, which is why newspapers are so important, because they can give you a glimpse into the everyday lives of people. Right. Of course, newspapers are also problematic because they present a certain perspective, but it's really, really difficult to find actual accounts. The further back you go, the more difficult it is to find original accounts from people who are not from this social political elite. Right. And that's an unfortunate fact of most history.
Absolutely. And that's why, writers like Burton had to say, no primary sources exist. And so the only source of our information is the records of the CPR and the local newspapers and so on, that their conviction that there were no primary sources. And so to find a primary source is such a thrill.
And again, like not to beat a dead horse here, but that's why this book is so important, right? Because it's so rare to have these, like these primary accounts coming from laborers and coming from the working class, because
right.
they rarely survive.
Okay, so let's see here. Oh wow, there's so many good questions. Oh, Glenn Richards asks actually a really interesting question, saying, it's important to remember that the railway was a colonial venture with roughly 5,000 Indigenous people expelled, and to make way for the CPR. And so sort of, how do we sort of think about the intersection of these sort of forms of erasure, when at the same time shedding light on the contributing role that Chinese people had played in developing this, and thinking about the larger context of Canada as a colonial project, and of Black people as well, and the history of slavery in Canada?
Well, yes, in Canada and everywhere. I mean, the thing about the Chinese workers is that the Chinese workers were embraced in great numbers by North America. I mean, certainly in the United States, but also in Canada, but for specific talking about the United States, not very long at all after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was interesting, of course, that the settler population, the colonialists, in 1865 lost their slaves and now began to have to look for other slaves. It was a period of rampant capitalism. People got very, very, very rich during that period, during the period of the Gilded Age and into the early turn of the century, off the backs of these workers who worked for $1 a day.
I've been exploring my family history recently for a while, given all the things that have been happened, but and in the course of that exploration, we found out that, I come from a Black family on my father's side who came up here on the land settlement in the late 19th century. But it wasn't really until recently that, in fact, we found out they were freed slaves from Alabama who left Alabama, went to Oklahoma, and then came to Canada. And so when I was exploring that background, and I read a really powerful article by a woman named Cynthia Williams in the States, who was talking about the abuse of slaves and how that led to white DNA in Black families' DNA. And I realized, since I had a DNA test, that, wow, that was my story. And it hit me incredibly hard. I could feel it. And it was a really shocking moment. But to double back to the subject here, so leading on from that subject, I started thinking about, well, are you a settler if, you come from a slave family? And I wondered about that. But then, and I asked that question of somebody who didn't answer it, but I'm sure they will. But in the course of answering the question, I realized, well, no, you have fallen into a binary opposition of settler, not settler. And there's lots of other classes. You don't have to fall into that opposition of settler, not settler. You don't have to be in that binary position. And from that, I led to thinking about people as instruments or weapons, if you will, of colonialism. So that's really what we're talking about here, is people being used as instruments and weapons of colonialism. The people who are most often used in those circumstances are people who come from distress scenarios themselves, where people who are having to flee their country, or who are perhaps indentured labor, slaves, or people who have to leave due to famine and stuff. So it's a very complex history that we start to unwall if we get away from the settler, not settler opposition. Obviously, the people who are involved in the colonial project of taking the land from the people that were here in the first place, but they weren't necessarily involved willingly. They were instruments of oppression. They were weapons of oppression, and that their own tragic histories are caught up in the tragic histories of our Indigenous people.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm getting a lot of private messages saying, wow, that was like, such an eloquent and articulate and sort of mind sort of blowing set of statements. So thank you. I've got another question. I think it's from one of the editors of the book saying, might David tell the story of the whole diary? Because what we have left are excerpts only. So what happened to the entire sort of work as a whole?
Hi, Katrina. Lovely for you to be here. I'm sorry I can't see you. So the story of goes back to Wanda Joy's decision to do this. I don't know whether any of you ever heard of Tom Bottomore. Tom Bottomore was a famous and distinguished socialist thinker who took over the Department of Sociology and anthropology and a number of departments at Simon Fraser University in its charter period in the 1960s when it first opened. He was a controversial man. He went back to England after 4 years. He left Simon Fraser because of the fights he would get into with the administration, but a fascinating guy. And Wanda Joy went to him with this notion that she had, this family with this history, and that there was probably this diary. Now, the history of the diary is that Dukesang Wong was the president of the Benevolent Society and also of something called the Wong Society, which he apparently president continent-wide for a while, but each community, each town, each city had its own Wong Society. And so he spent a lot of his time working in his office at that society, and wrote much of his diary in there when he had his own private time. And what happened was there became a conflict between the family, Wong's family, and the Wong Society, which is this larger organization, about who had ownership of the diaries. And so when Wanda Joy decided she wanted to do this, and Bottomore encouraged her to do it, she realized that she couldn't go as Wanda Joy Wong, who she was at the time. No, sorry, she couldn't go as Wanda Joy Ho because they would know that she was related to Dukesang. So she created a false name and went and asked if she could borrow these diaries that she had heard about to talk about the history of the Chinese in New Westminster. And they agreed to give it to her, and they did give it to her, and she took it home. And she and her uncles, Dukesang Wong's sons, and they were elderly at the time, pored over the diaries, chose the sections they wanted to translate, translated them. And then a few weeks later, somebody came knocking at the door from the Wong Society and said, "You have the diary, we want it back." And they gave it back. And very shortly thereafter, it was lost in a building fire at the Wong Society, and the original diary is gone. And we no longer have it, sadly. It would have been a wonderful thing to find in the, the BC Museum and Archives. But but Wanda Joy had, this translation that she'd done, and so she took it and did it and handed it in to her professor, who said it was wonderful and gave her an A, and then she put it in a box. She put it in a box because, as I did with university projects that I did, and carried it with her for years. She worked for UNESCO, and she worked in Paris, she worked in New York, she worked in Washington, working for the Canadian government, but always carrying this translation of her grandfather's diary that she had done. And we had the great good fortune to find a reference to that somewhere in a drawer in a museum in Agassiz, British Columbia, a tiny little museum. Found the record. I went to Simon Fraser to ask if they could connect me with her. They said they were sorry, they couldn't give me any information about her. And so I went to the Alumni Association next, and they said, we can't give you any information about her, but they were intrigued by what I was trying to do. So they said, but what we will do is we'll contact her and tell her that there's this person who wants to contact her and give her your name and contact information. And 2 days later, she called me from Ottawa. And when she told me what she had, I got on an airplane and flew to Ottawa. That's what that happened. But there was hard feelings between this Wong Society and the family. And the family felt that the books should, 50 years of diaries should rightfully belong to them. But that's a moot point because it was lost in a fire anyway. I don't know whether that answers the question. It was a fascinating little story that Wanda Joy had to disguise herself, and that people came to the door kind of threateningly to get it back. It's all, there are, I have to say that there are many little stories like that in this book that I was obviously not able to talk about today. Tragic stories, fun stories, funny stories that I learned from the family that when I couldn't get the information from the diary, and it's a fascinating and fascinating story. Anyway.
Thank you, David. That is really fascinating. I think that's probably a good place to conclude tonight's official portion of the global premiere book launch.